We live in a culture that makes self-focus feel almost criminal. The moment you start turning your attention inward, whether it's to protect your peace, set boundaries, that by holding your, or simply mind your own business, someone will inevitably accuse you of being selfish, distant, or even arrogant. But here's the thing, focusing on yourself isn't selfish, it's survival. In a world that's constantly trying to pull you in 1,000 directions, the most radical act you can commit is to make yourself your first priority. This isn't about narcissism or indulgence. I'm not talking about endless self-pampering or performing some curated version of self-care for social media. No, I'm talking about a deeper form of focus, an intentional and unapologetic return to your own center. Because when you're constantly giving your energy away, chasing validation, comparing your path to someone else's, explaining yourself to people who aren't even trying to understand, you end up hollowed out, you become a shell of yourself, full of noise but lacking depth. Philosophers throughout history have out this in various ways. The Stoics, for example, urged people to concern themselves only with what they could control, namely, their own thoughts and actions. Epictetus said, if you want to improve, by holding you'll be content to be thought foolish and stupid. Now think about that for a second. To truly grow, you have to let go of how others perceive you. You have to choose peace over popularity. And that's not easy in a culture that sells identity like it's fashion, where who you are is constantly broadcast, judged, rated, that by holding you're monetized. But here's where the real power lies, when you begin to see your time, your energy, and your attention as sacred. Sacred. You stop wasting them on people and things that don't feed your growth. You stop explaining your vision to people who haven't the right to hear it. You stop trying to convince others of your worth because you've already convinced yourself. That's what self-focus does. It creates a foundation so solid that you no longer need outside scaffolding to stand upright. Psychologically, this is crucial. Your brain is wired to protect your sense of self. When you constantly outsource your identity to others, seeking affirmation or fearing rejection, you enter a chronic state of stress. Cortisol spikes, anxiety builds, and your ability to focus, to create, to be, diminishes. But when you start invest self-intentionally, reading, journaling, exercising, creating boundaries, feeding your mind with real substance, you shift. You go from reacting to directing. You go from noise to signal. It's not glamorous. It's often lonely. There's no applause in the early mornings when you're sitting in silence, sorting out your inner world. No one's giving you a medal for choosing reflection over distraction. But this is where transformation begins, not in the spotlight, but in the shadows, in the silence, in the slow, patient work of becoming someone you respect by holding your. I think we've confused connection with availability. Just because someone can reach you doesn't mean they should. Just because you can speak doesn't mean the right time to. When you start focusing on yourself, you get very selective. Not out of arrogance, but out of clarity. You realize that energy is not infinite. And every conversation, every commitment, every interaction is an investment. Ask yourself, what am I investing in? That by holding your, who benefits from this attention? Is it building me or breaking me? So yes, focus on yourself, not because the world doesn't matter, but because you can't contribute anything real to the world if you're constantly fragmented. You cannot pour from an empty cup, but you can overflow if you're full. That's the paradox of true self-focused. It's not about shutting the world out. It's about building enough inner strength so that when you do engage, you bring something meaningful to the table. And when you pair that self-focus with silence, real intentional quiet, something even more powerful happens. You begin to hear yourself. Not the conditioned version, not the insecure chatter, but the deeper self. The self that knows what you're meant to do. Even when the world tries to convince you otherwise. So start small, turn inward. Get honest, cut the noise. Not for anyone else, for you. By holding your. Because the most radical thing you can do in a loud, demanding world is to know who you are and stay rooted there. By holding your. Protect your energy like your life depends on it, because in a very real way it does. Silence. It's one of the most misunderstood forces in our lives. Somewhere along the line got the idea that being silent means being weak, being passive, being invisible. That, if you're not constantly speaking up, showing up, putting yourself out there, then you're somehow falling behind. But I want to challenge that assumption. Because silence, real intentional silence, is not weakness. It's power in its most concentrated form. We live in a culture obsessed with noise, verbal noise, digital noise, emotional by whole noise. Everyone's saying to something, reacting, performing for someone. Social media has trained us to think that every thought deserves a platform, every emotion a broadcast. You feel angry, post about it. You feel inspired, share it immediately. You have a plan, announce it before you even take the first step. But all of that constant output leaves very little room for internal input. There's no stillness, no listening, just transmission without reception. But silence, it's subversive. It says, I don't need to prove anything to you right now. It says, I trust the process I'm in, even if you don't see it. And that takes guts. Because the ego loves attention. The ego thrives on being seen, being heard, being validated. Silence starves the ego. That's why it feels so uncomfortable at first. It's not just quiet, it's confronting. Think about it psychologically. When you choose silence, especially in a culture addicted to visibility, you're disrupting a cycle. You're creating space between stimulus and response. You're saying, I don't have to react. I don't have to perform. That space, that's where power lives. That by holding your, it's where you regain control over your thoughts, your emotions, your energy. It's where discernment is born. The people who've mastered themselves by holding your, the people who build meaningful lives, they're not the ones shouting the loudest. They're the ones listening, observing, calculating. They're conserving energy. By holding your, because when you're silent, you're not disengaged. You're focused, you're pulling your awareness back into yourself like drawing a bowstring. And when it's time to act or speak, that release is far more precise, far more powerful than any constant stream of chatter. Philosophically, this isn't a new idea. Eastern traditions have long emphasized silence as a pathway to wisdom. In Zen, the master often responds to a question not with an answer, but with stillness. In that stillness, the student is forced to confront their own assumptions. The answer, if it comes, doesn't come from the outside. It arises from within. That's the pointing. Silence isn't the absence of communication. It's the space where deeper truth becomes audible. There's also a tactical angle here, because let's be honest, not everyone around you has your best interests in mind. Sharing your intentions, your goals, your insecurities with the wrong audience can sabotage your growth before it even begins. By holding your, not because they're evil, because they project their own fears onto your potential. Silence protects your process. It shields you from unnecessary feedback and premature judgment. And it's not just about big plans or life goals. Even in everyday interactions, silence is a tool. You don't always have to defend yourself. You don't always have to explain. Sometimes the strongest response is no response. Because when you stop reacting, you become unpredictable. And unpredictability is a form of power. People start to second guess how to manipulate you, how to provoke you. They realize they don't control your attention anymore, and that's liberating both for you and strangely for them. Now, of course, this doesn't mean you go mute and disappear from the world. It's about strategic silence, knowing when to speak and when to observe, when to engage and when to step back, by holding your, when to share and when to build in private. It's about reclaiming your voice by choosing when and how it's used, not letting the world yank it out of you on demand. By holding your, and here's the irony, when you embrace silence, you start to hear more, not just the noise around you, but what's happening underneath it. By holding your, you begin to notice patterns in people's behavior. You begin to detect what's genuine and what's performative. You begin to understand yourself in ways that were previously drowned out by the chaos. And that understanding, that's power. Not loud, flashy power, but enduring, unshakable power. So if you want to be strong, be silent. If you want to stay focused, say less. Let them wonder. Let them speculate. Let your results speak volumes where your words do not. The quieter you become, the more powerful your presence becomes. Let the silence build you. Let it speak for you. There's this strange modern compulsion to announce everything. We've been conditioned to think that the second we have an idea, a plan, a moment of motivation, by holding your, we need to declare it to the world. I'm starting a new routine. I've got a big project coming. Big things are happening soon. And we think that by saying it, by putting it out into the ether, we've somehow taken the first step toward it. But let me ask you something. Has that ever really moved the needle? Or has it, more often than not, holding your, created a false sense of progress? There's a psychological trap at play here. By holding your, when you talk about your goals too much, when you broadcast your intentions before you've done the actual work, you activate the same reward systems in the brain as if you've already accomplished something. That by holding your, that little dopamine hit, approval from others, that applause for a promise rather than a result, it's seductive, but it's hollow. It robs you of the tension, the drive, the discomfort that's actually required to do the thing. You end up addicted to the feeling of potential rather than the reality of effort. And effort, real effort, is usually invisible. It's repetitive, unglamorous, and unbeknownst. Claps for the person who wakes up early every day to train by holding your, or who quietly writes for months before releasing a single sentence. There's no applause for discipline. And yet, that's where everything is built, in silence, in obscurity, in the mundane grind of consistent, unseen action. When you talk less and do more, something fundamental shifts. You stop seeking validation and start seeking transformation. Because transformation doesn't require an audience, it requires integrity. And integrity is what you do when no one's watching. It's the commitment to your process, even when it's boring, even when it's hard, even when the results are nowhere to be seen. Philosophically, this touches on something ancient. The Tao Te Ching says, "He who knows not speak. He who speaks does not know." Now, doesn't mean we should live in total silence, but it's a warning against the illusion of knowing the formants of wisdom. We must be cautious not to confuse talk with mastery or public image with internal development, because mastery in any form, spiritual, physical, creative, requires immersion, and immersion doesn't broadcast itself, it absorbs. There's also something deeply powerful about moving in silence, because it removes the weight of expectation. When you tell everyone what you're going to do, you immediately inherit their opinions, projections, doubts, and hopes. It becomes harder to pivot, to adapt, to fail quietly and recalibrate. But when you keep your movements internal, you're free to evolve in real time without performance pressure, free to make mistakes without commentary. You're free to finish things before the world even knows you've started. This isn't about secrecy for secrecy's sake. It's about building strength without leaking energy. Every time you speak on a thing too soon, you leak a bit of the force required to bring it to life. You trade focus for feedback, but feedback isn't fuel, especially not premature feedback. It distorts. It creates friction between your original intention and the version that now exists in someone else's mind. And when you start building to please that imagined audience, you lose the authenticity of the original spark. So instead, let your work speak, let your results speak, let the reality of your discipline, your commitment, your quiet persistence echo louder than any proclamation, because that kind of power, the kind that comes from actual transformation, is unmistakable. It doesn't need a megaphone. People feel it when you walk into a room, how they see it in move, how you choose, how you carry yourself. You don't have to announce who you are. You embody it. And this embodiment, it becomes a way of life. You begin to prioritize movement over momentum, depth over noise, process over performance. You recognize that saying less is not withholding, it's concentrating, it's preserving the sacredness of your growth from the chaos of outside interpretation by holding your. So don't just talk about it, don't just post about it, don't just tease what's coming. Go away quietly and come back undeniable. Discipline isn't something you stumble into. It's not a burst of motivation after watching a YouTube video or reading a quote on Instagram. It's not loud, not exciting, not romantic. Discipline is quiet, it's solitary, it's repetitive. And if you're doing it right, it'll feel like nothing is happening for a long time by holding your. That's the paradox. The most transformative parts of your life often look like stillness to everyone else. The real work doesn't happen in the spotlight. It happens in the quiet hours when no one's watching, no one's asking how you're doing, and no one's cheering you on. It happens when you choose to stick to your routine, to your principles, to your personal code, when you could very easily break it and no one would know. That's the part people don't talk about by holding your. That the pursuit of a disciplined life, whether it's physical, mental, spiritual, requires deliberate isolation by holding your. And I don't mean you have to go live in the woods or become a monk. What I mean is to be truly disciplined, you have to be willing to disconnect from the distractions that constantly pull you away from yourself, from the noise, the opinions, the little dopamine hits we get from likes, messages, and conversations that don't nourish us. Because let's be honest, most people don't want you to be disciplined. Not really. Because your discipline reminds them of their lack of it. Your silence, your consistency, your refusal to participate in mediocrity, it makes people uncomfortable. That discomfort isn't your problem to fix. Your job is not to shrink to think to fit into other people's comfort zones. Your job is to stay loyal to what you're building, even if it means you have to do it alone for a while. And that's hard because we're social creatures. We crave connection. We crave recognition. But if you're not careful, that craving becomes a weakness. It becomes a loophole in your system. One conversation turns into a distraction. One night out becomes a week off. And before you know it, by holding you're no longer living by your own design. You're reacting to the rhythms of people who aren't on the same path. There's a phrase from Nietzsche I always come back to. Invisible threads are the strongest ties. That's what discipline is. It's this invisible thread that connects you to your future self. And no one else can see it, which means they won't understand why you're saying no to certain things. They won't get why you're not available like you used to be, why you're not posting as much, why you're not responding instantly, why you've become more withdrawn, more selective, more intentional, but you will. Because that solitude, that withdrawal, it isn't distance that by holding it's depth. You're not pulling away from life, you're sinking into it. By holding you start to realize that freedom doesn't come from doing whatever you want. It comes from choosing what you want most over what you want right now by holding And you can't even make that choice clearly if you're surrounded by noise. You need that space, that silence, that inner dialogue. You need boredom. You need emptiness. You need to sit long enough in the stillness that your excuses start to sound ridiculous and your clarity becomes undeniable. Holding and that's the discipline nobody talks about. The discipline of sitting with yourself, of facing your own mind, not numbing it, not escaping it, by holding not performing over it, but really being with it. That's where it all starts. That's where the changes happen that no one can see but that you can feel by holding That's where your identity shifts, where your choices get sharper and your purpose starts to crystallize, not because someone handed it to you, but because you earned it in silence. You emerge from that solitude not just with results, but with authority. You're no longer explaining yourself, that by holding you're not looking for approval. You're not trying to be understood. You are understood by the right people at the right time, because the discipline shaped you into someone who doesn't need to shout. Your presence does the talking. So don't be afraid to disappear for a while. Don't be afraid to decline the invites, to close the apps, to wake up early and go to bed tired with no one cheering you on. That's the work. That's the edge. And that's where the transformation lies. Starve your distractions, feed your purpose. Let your solitude sharpen you into someone unstoppable.